Greetings, my name is Waddell Brooks Sr., your host, and this is Community Forum. This afternoon we're attending the Lakeshore campus of the College of Lake County, where the Minority Affairs Committee of the County Board, the Department of Human Resources, along with the Lake County Urban League, the Race Unity Task Force of Lake County, all are sponsoring an address by Dr. Robert C. Henderson on issues surrounding culture, diversity in the workplace. On my right is Bob Neal, County Board member, District number 2, and Bob is also a candidate for Recorder of Deeds for Lake County. Good afternoon, Bob.
Good afternoon to you, Waddell.
Bob, tell us, why is a session on cultural diversity necessary in Lake County?
I think the more that we talk about it and the more we get people involved in talking about it, the sooner we're going to end all the different racial overtones that go on in the workplace as well as in the community.
Bob, you're a candidate for Recorder of Deeds. Tell us a little bit about the Office of Recorder of Deeds.
Well, the most important part of the office is when you buy a piece of property, then the title company goes to the recorder's office and checks the history of that piece of property. Number one, to make sure that the person that's selling it to you owns it. And number two, to make sure there's no outstanding liens or who they owe money and who's got liens against it. So that's probably the most important part of the office, because obviously your house is probably the most important thing you buy, at least the most expensive thing you buy in your lifetime. That represents about 20% of the time involved in the office. The rest of the time is spent with liens that are put on people and businesses by the government, whether it's the state or the federal, or like if a business borrows money against their inventory, then there's a lien put on against that inventory so that they can't sell the business, and they have the suspecting new proprietor find out, oh my goodness, there's money owed against the inventory. So it's a very, very important office.
Bob, I've been knowing you for a long time. You're a businessman, and you've been very active in the county, and I'm sure you're looking forward to this fall in the election. Tell us about, have you had a chance to look over the Recorder of Deeds office, and how is cultural diversity represented there?
Well, I have not gone in and actually looked it over, although I've been in the office a number of different times, and they do have people of different ethnic backgrounds working in the office, so I think Frank Nostra has done a pretty good job, and I think he's very aware of culture diversity.
Very good. We're talking with Dr. John Schuligan, and John, we go back a long ways too, from Rotary and bowling and several other activities within the county. You have been recently elected to a county board. How long have you been served on the county board?
I've been on the board for going on 4 years, and I'm running again for another 4-year term, Waddell.
Okay, tell us about your activity on the county board.
Well, I'm chairman of the Health and Human Services Committee of the county board, and that committee is the one which has oversight over the budget of Winchester House, as well as the health department. And on the health department, I also serve on that board, and I'm vice president of our Board of Health.
You attended the Cultural Diversity Workshop last year also, didn't you, at the county board building?
Yeah, yes, I did.
Okay, so you're familiar with Dr. Henderson and so forth. Why do you think cultural diversity is necessary in Lake County?
Well, I think Bob Neal said it very well, that we have a very culturally diverse county, and while it does represent a broad spectrum of cultures, I think that they have tended to isolate themselves into certain areas, and I think it's important that everyone, even though you're from a certain area and you represent and buy into a certain culture, that you understand the diverse cultures that we have within our country, and Lake County is very similar to our country within our county.
John, you play an active role in the county also. You're a Republican chairperson?
I'm chairman of the Lake County Republican Party, right.
All right, so you stay active that way too also, right?
Sure do.
Is there a cultural diversity within the Republican Party?
Well, I think there is. I think that our party is, of course, open to anyone that wants to join the party, wants to participate in it, and we look forward, and we do have some cultural diversity within it as well.
And one final last word, and Bob, we may mention to you also that if we don't have cultural diversity with our workforce, we're missing out on a great opportunity for talent then, right?
Oh, absolutely, Waddell. One of the efforts of my campaign, of course, it's all volunteer, but I said I want a cultural diverse volunteer team, and we've been very successful. We have people from every walk of life, Afro-Americans as well as Hispanics, as well as Irish and German and all the rest of them. But we have a great team, and I think that all you have to do is look at my volunteer team, and you'll know where I come from.
Okay. Gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for appearing on Community Forum, and we're looking forward to Dr. Robert Henderson's, well, we may call it a speech, or we call it a lecture, information, a sharing of information with us this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm going to be in a second. And I'll have to go back and rotate. Okay. But once I hook you up, then you're kind of limited on my time. Yeah, so you pretty much right here. Okay. I just don't want you to trip.
If I can have your attention, we're ready to start. I want to thank the county board members for coming so early to this event. I want everyone to recognize them for that. I think it's a first in the history of the county that board members have been on time or even early for anything. In that regard, Angelo Kyle is the chairman of the Minority Affairs Committee, but Angelo had to find himself with an appointment in Chicago. So he has very capably appointed Audrey Nixon to introduce this and to recognize those folks who are here who need recognition. So let me give you Audrey Nixon.
Let me first thank all of you for coming to the workshop today. This workshop is sponsored by the Minority Affairs Committee, the Human Resource Department, and the Urban League, and the Racial Unity Task Force of Lake County. And the purpose of this workshop today is to monitor the hiring practice of the county as it relates to minorities. Second is to monitor the number of minority contracts awarded through the county. And third is to sponsor the workshop like this to show the ethnic diversity of the county as a strength and not as a weakness. I told Angelo today, boy, am I going to get him later on. But I would again like to welcome all of you for being here today. And I would like to introduce the Minority Affairs Committee, Mrs. Susie Smith, and Angelo Kyle as the chairman, and Audrey Nixon. We also have our county board members here today, and I'm going to ask them to stand and introduce themselves and say what district they represent so that I won't miss anybody. So I'll start from the front on this side, and then we'll go to the other side.
Deborah Alice, District 9, Waukegan.
Jim Stanzik, District 8, Waukegan.
Susie Schmidt, District 3, Lakeville Township, and part of Avon Township. Carol Calabresa, Libertyville, District 15. Judy Markey, District 1, that includes Antioch, part of Lakeville. Diana O'Kelly, Fremont Township, and Levelland, District 1.
Okay, this side over here.
Mark Bobian from Yuba Township, Southwest Lake County. Although I was born and raised in Waukegan, I remember this as a high song at the Buffalo Globe.
Carol Steelman, Highland Park and Deerfield, District 22.
Okay, is this all the board members? Okay, I'm Audrey Nixon, District 14, North Chicago, and thank you again.
Thank you, Audrey. Robert Barth, past president of Rotary International, observes that we live in a world where people and societies are demanding their rights. And responsible people actively participate in the community, the culture, and the civilization where they live. Responsible people keep an open attitude toward other cultures and other civilizations, and the responsible person challenges the values that they believe are harmful to an enlightened community. They understand that their own values may benefit from looking to other cultures and other people for a new perspective. The responsible person considers the impact of their actions on the future, and they recognize that we are part of our natural environment and are its caretakers. And finally, in a world rich with knowledge, the responsible person remains open to discovery. Today we find ourselves together, a group of responsible people, and the actions we take are those that count. I'm pleased to be able to introduce to you Dr. Robert Henderson. Dr. Henderson has worked as a management consultant specializing in productivity improvement and management development. His public service includes membership on the Martin Luther King Jr. Federal Holiday Commission, the Eli Wiesel Foundation Conference co-sponsored by the Governor of New York on Religion and Hate, and Dr. Henderson is the Secretary General of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'i Faith of the United States. Dr. Henderson's topic today is the prerequisites of racial, ethnic, and religious unity. Welcome, please, Dr. Henderson.
Thank you very much, and I hate to begin with a complaint, but since I'm here and the weather is so bad, I cannot help but observe that we've got to do something about this. Some kind of citizen initiative is called for. I mean, really, for those of us who have been in the area for a long time, I've been here myself for about 13 years, and I don't ever remember a spring that was as dismal and bleak as this one. Does anybody? Has there ever? It seems like I looked in the yellow pages for Noah's number. I was sure the second coming was imminent. I mean, somebody's got to be building big boats, and we're all going to be on them pretty soon if it doesn't stop raining. But I'm very happy to be here for a couple of reasons. First of all, I'm delighted to be anywhere where the citizenry is banding together to raise questions about how we build a more perfect and equitable union, because that is the essence of the American experiment. And we have yet to perfect this vision of one nation under God with liberty and justice for all. But anywhere that citizens gather and raise the question of how do we begin to foster a collective understanding of the requirements of unity and justice, what sacrifices will be required for us to establish justice and equity for every single citizen in the community, what kinds of policies, what structure of organizations. These are the critical questions that we're faced with as a nation. But these questions will not be answered by federal policy alone. It won't necessarily be answered by a change in the presidential leadership or in the direction of one branch of government or another. It'll be answered in large part at the grassroots of American society, where individual and small groups of citizens come together and begin to ponder these questions at a fundamental level of how do we make it right for our children so that successive generations will not repeat the mistakes of the past, but have skills commensurate with the vision of unity and justice as a nation. That is a different kind of orientation. It is a different kind of discussion that we've been engaged in for a long time, and, and I think it is a fundamentally important one. Second, I'm happy because generally when the question of racial and religious and ethnic equity and unity are raised, it's generally not raised in such a positive context. It's generally raised as a response to some precipitous event. Something bad happens. It reminds us that we ought to be doing more work to bring the races together and to establish equity, and therefore we have a meeting generally resulting in the appointment of a commission. Is that how the formula goes? Did I miss a step? Very seldom do we call ourselves together voluntarily to ask ourselves what are the prerequisites of unity and diversity. How do we bring all of the citizens together in a pattern of interaction and under policy and with a vision that will allow us to build a style of community life which will foment equity, which will create harmony, which will even out the kinks in the way we live our lives and the way that we think. It should be evident to everyone with regard to the 30 churches in the South that have been burnt by arson recently, that whether or not this is the product of a particular conspiracy, whether or not a single individual or a single group of people have conspired to burn down these churches, where children and families worship, where weddings are conducted, where burial services and memorial services are held to honor the lives of people who've been steadfast in the covenants of the church, who have prayed and asked God to lead their lives in a more productive and spiritual direction, who have sought avenues of community service, because those churches are places where the hungry can go and guarantee to be fed. Those churches are places where at any moment of distress, a family can reach out to those churches and be guaranteed that they will be embraced by a loving community that is responsive and sensitive to their needs and really wants to hear what their concerns are. How in the world can we not be alarmed by such a systematic attack on the very foundation of our belief as a nation? And whether or not this is the byproduct of a particular conspiracy, as citizens of the United States of America, we must all be alarmed that this is definitely the byproduct of a collective environment in which racial disharmony and conflict is all too widely tolerated, and in which conflict based on race and ethnicity and various kinds of diversity is okay. Hate talk is okay. And the reason, and the way that we know this, is that our demographic data tells us that year after year, hate crimes in the United States rise by about 300%. 300%. That is a shocking and dramatic increase. And you know where they're rising the fastest? On college campuses. The very places that had been the battlegrounds of justice and freedom and equity under law have become the arenas in which divisive and contentious talk about racial differences has been sanctioned to the extent that hate crime is flourishing on American college campuses. So when a community decides that it is going to preoccupy its concern with how we build unity, how we foster understanding, how we build bridges of cooperation and agreement and harmony, that is a very important concern, because most of the time that we talk about race, we talk about problems. Very seldom when we talk about race do we talk about what it's going to take to build the antidote to race hatred, which is race unity. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of our concern with race unity as a nation. I'm going to make some observations of about where we are as a society and how that relates to us here and now. And then I'm going to make some very specific suggestions about the principles that, in my view, are prerequisite to a fundamental change in the spirit and character of the American nation and the citizens that populate our community, and give you some examples about how that illustrate how these principles are translated into action that confront the very roots of the social problems which are vexing communities all over these United States. And I'm going to try to do that briefly so that we save some time for some questions after a bit. First of all, I want to mention that we have a particular dilemma as Americans, because the United States of America was born a nation of the most noble vision ever dreamed by human beings. This nation was born with the motto, E pluribus unum, out of many people, we will forge one people. That was the founding vision of the Founding Fathers. It's a nation whose ideals of freedom under law have not only been the foundation of the development of the American nation, but have been the inspiration of nations worldwide and peoples all over the globe. The idea that slavery was abolished in the United States in the mid-19th century was the precipitating force that caused a universal abolition of slavery worldwide. And although various initiatives had already been made prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, it really was, historians tell us, the American nation's action which caused the fatal blow to be delivered to slavery all over the world. When the Founding Fathers envisaged the American nation, they had a very specific ideal in mind. Not only would there be this nation in which people from all four corners of the world would gather together and build a more perfect union than had ever been known, they wanted to redeem the mistakes of the past. Philosophers who were the cornerstone of the development of the American nation, people like Thomas Paine, said that we have it in our power to start the world all over again. He said that the past was the textbook of tyranny, but the future is the Bible of the free. Can you imagine being at the moment of the birth of a nation in which people would say things like the past is the textbook of tyranny, but the future is the Bible of the free, and we have an opportunity as the founders of the new nation to do it differently. George Washington himself said that the bosom of America is open to people of all races, ethnicities, and religions, so that we may build of this nation one race and one people. Now, he had, in those days, race was used differently. The people of a nation were considered a race. The modern concept of race, white, black, brown, red, and yellow, had yet to evolve. But what he was talking about was a nation in which the citizens agreed, a nation in which the citizens cooperated, a nation in which the citizens had equal protection under the law. Now, never mind the fact that there were all kinds of contradictions in the individual lives of leaders like Washington. Washington expressed this noble vision, but at the same time he owned slaves. The truth is, everybody everywhere owned slaves, in all nations. That was a part of the evolution and development of humanity as a species. But the important and critical element was that a process had been set in motion which would cause the abolition of slavery in this nation and worldwide, and that it was prerequisite to the next stage of human development. So for those who would say that we're kind of locked in a paralyzing contradiction, that is, everybody wants to make it better. Everybody wants for racism to be abolished, everybody wants for injustice to be abolished, and blah, blah, blah. But people say, well, you know, human beings are just too selfish and too aggressive. And therefore, I don't know if we'll ever be able to build the kind of society that is at once harmonious and cooperative, but at the same time gives free play to individual initiative and creativity. Well, I would say to you that prejudice, war, and exploitation are symptomatic of the early stages of human evolution as a species, and that this is not the end of humanity or the end of civilized development. This is simply the turbulent adolescence of the development of human life on the planet. And for all of us who have teenagers, you all know exactly what I'm talking about. I had a talk with mine this morning. I've got two, one at the University of Illinois, I got another at the University of Michigan. She's registering at Michigan this minute. I don't even know how I can stand up here. I'm petrified with fear. My baby is gone. God, I'll be in therapy for years. I don't know. And then I'm looking at my young son, the baby, who at 14 years old is taller than me and has to shave or his face gets too fuzzy. And we had that talk this morning. You know the talk I'm talking about. The one that says, son, you got to get with the program. You know the talk I'm talking about. And that reminded him that his name is not Miles B. Henderson. It can be Miles A. minus Henderson, and it can be Miles A. Henderson, but it can't be Miles B. Henderson, and it is certainly not Miles C. Henderson. And if it ever becomes Miles D. Henderson, he might be Miles passed away Henderson. We had that talk. But you see, this is symptomatic of the turbulent adolescence of any organization, of any human being. You reach a point at which there are eminent signs of maturity, but there are all kinds of contradictions which frustrate us endlessly. So at the same time that we see universal cooperation at an unprecedented level worldwide, Groups of nations cooperating on everything from the environment to arms reductions to the economy to the cooperation of nations, the economic union of Europe, and so on. At the same time that we see that, we also see all of the contention and contradictions that are symptomatic of a humanity that has yet to grow up. So we have to begin to see our development as communities and as individuals in that context. It is a vast process that has proceeded over thousands of years, and that does not mean that we should be patient with our shortcomings. It just gives us a perspective that is realistic. Now let's begin to talk about what has happened with that vision. That vision, that noble ideal of freedom under law, of oneness and unity, had enshrined in the midst of it a blaring contradiction, and that is the enshrinement of slavery in the Constitution. You can't have one nation with justice and equity for everyone and slaves at the same time. And the problem that we face as a nation today is that we have yet to exorcise the problem of inequality from the national mind. And so today we have a lot of the symptoms of that. You know, we look at the equity of black people and white people, and the truth is we are farther away from equity among the races today than we were 50 years ago. Right now, there is less social contact between black people and white people than there was 50 years ago. Right now, the distance between black folks and white folks in housing, in employment, in education, in job placement, is greater than it was many years ago. And the result is the hopelessness that we see burning our cities down and crushing our children. We look at the period just since the Great Society. In 1968, we initiated a war on poverty, and we said we were going to wipe poverty out within our lifetimes, and we made a very good start. Do you realize that during the war on poverty, we had a 50% reduction of poverty in real terms? 50%. Do you realize what we would do to get 50% of reduction of poverty today? And what it would cost us? The only question is why we stopped fighting. Because we were winning that war. And that was the day in which Head Start and Model Cities and a whole bunch of creative initiatives were started, and frankly, it was a time of unprecedented cooperation among the races, focused on problems that were sabotaging the nation as a whole and leading to the destruction of black life and the lives of poor people and people of color from coast to coast. Since that time, we stopped fighting, and let me tell you what the results were. Since that time, we have had a tripling of the gross domestic product. That is, in constant dollars, the gross domestic product has increased by 300%. Likewise, our spending on social programs in constant dollars has increased by almost $800 billion. And yet we stand in 1996 with an almost 600% increase since that period in 1968 in violent crime. A 400% increase in divorces. A 200% increase in teenage suicide. And when you look at the black population, I'll just use black people as an example because it represents a classic case. When you look at the black population, you'll find that all of those numbers are increased dramatically. While we started college programs in the 60s, in fact, I went to college on one of those programs. I would never have gotten a doctorate any other way. I went to college and I was in the collegiate committee for the education of black students. While I was there, I fell in love with education policy and management and ended up getting a doctorate and going a way that I would never have dreamed of when I was a little kid on the east side of Watts in Los Angeles. It would never have crossed my mind that those possibilities were open to me. And yet, today, in 1996, there are more black men in jail than there are on college campuses. And I'm telling you that that's not a problem for black people, that is a problem for the nation. because it sabotages the stability of the nation as a whole. Let me tell you how. In 1890, despite the vicissitudes of slavery, during which time it was illegal for black people to read, and it was legal to sell the children or the mother or the father of any black family anywhere you wanted. Despite the vicissitudes of slavery, in 1890, 83% of all black families were intact. A mother, a father, and kids. In 1996, 72% of all black children are born out of wedlock. That is a prescription for disaster. Those children will not receive proper medical attention. They won't receive proper dental attention. There will be no one to shape their spirit and character. And right now in the city of Chicago, the kids that will enter kindergarten next September, it'll be about just under 100,000 5-year-olds. 85% of those kids will be black, and 70% of those kids will not know their last names. They will not be able to tell you who they are or where they live. And while we ought to be paying attention to teaching them how to read, to shaping their sense of values and morals and ethics, to teaching them how to cooperate, and helping them to begin to dream of being firemen and computer operators and builders and family folks and so on, we're going to be trying to figure out how to stop the decay of their teeth, how to get the lice out of their hair, how to feed them, and where they in fact live, and who caretakes those kids. And I'm telling you, you cannot produce 100,000 kids with those kinds of problems every year without a destabilization of the community as a whole. And we've been producing those kids for a long time. So much so that in the Chicago Housing Authority, where there are 27,000 families, 81% of those children have a girl under 15, and 80% of those girls have a child. So who's going to raise mom when mom is a child? I mean, who's going to raise the children when mom is a child? You see, now this is not just a problem for black folks, and it's not just an issue of black people doing more to help themselves. It is a fundamental challenge of the American vision. And whether or not we're going to be a nation which recognizes the organic relationship that exists among all peoples and all elements of a society. In the old days, they taught us this in Sunday school. A nation divided cannot stand. It was a law then, it's a law now. Systems theorists explain to us that there is an organic relationship that goes beyond the family and the community and the state and the nation. It's worldwide. So today, something in a tiny little nation like Iraq, which most of us never heard of 20 years ago, begins to dominate the concern and the national policy of a nation and causes us to spend billions of dollars in a brief war, during which a shooting war, and I don't mean to be excessively negative, but while I'm on the point, I will mention to you that during the period of the Iraqi war, more black men died on one weekend in Los Angeles than soldiers died in a shooting war in the entire period of the Iraqi war. Now that's insane. That's madness. And what I'm saying to you is that this is not an issue that we can be casual about. It is an issue that shakes the very foundation of the nation itself. Let us remember that the riots of the 60s were followed by the riots of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And that all that happens is that they get more widespread, and the hopelessness becomes greater and greater. Why else would Mayor Daley summon the state police and the National Guard in anticipation of a basketball championship? Explain to me how people become so hopeless and so filled with despair that even the victory of the home team becomes an opportunity to vent the rage of hopelessness that surrounds and engulfs their lives. And in the meantime, we are not doing as a nation those fundamental things that we need to do in order to bring ourselves together. Let's talk about what those are. In the Baha'i Faith, which is organized around the principle of unity, the central teaching is that the unity and equality of all people is essential to social progress, that there cannot be social progress without systematic attention to the issue of equality, justice, and unity among all people. Now that doesn't sound like rocket science until you try to do it as a way of life. It seems to me that there are going to be several fundamental requirements in order to make a fundamental change in the spirit and character of our nation. And let's be clear that we're not just talking about a change in social policy or a change in structure. That is easy for us to do. It is easy for us to vote the appointment of a commission or even the expense of an insignificant number of dollars. It is much harder for me to say, Bob, I've got to change. I've got to begin to think differently. I've got to broaden my friendship pattern. I've got to reach out and change my life in a way that strengthens my capacity to be a builder of unity and strengthens the community as a whole. You know, we've gone from blatant racism to what social scientists are calling modern racism in our administrative policy. And the modern racism is never as overt as, I'm not going to hire you because you're black. We interview all of the appropriate candidates, and then we suggest, we select Jim, and the code word is, you know, Jim's going to fit in here. We know Jim, we like Jim, Jim's going to be, I'm not sure Bob would fit in. I'm not sure Bob would be happy. And what happens is that without some specific assistance, some guideline, white candidates, and specifically white male candidates, are chosen 97% of the time. Now, that's not me saying that. Those are the business schools of America who have conducted studies on these issues to chart how those decisions are made. And it's a kind of a go along to get along, let's do the right thing, which turns out too often to be the white thing. To get at the spirit and character of a nation, we've got to begin to ask ourselves different questions. First of all, leadership has got to be redefined. And we've got to begin to ask ourselves, where are the leaders who will stand up for what is right because it is right, who will not cave in to partisan interests, and who will lead us with humility and with love to do the principled thing in the best interest of the entire community. We have become a political system of partisans in which the debate about the well-being of people is in the back seat of the car, and what's driving the car are the partisan interests of policies, of parties. And the result is that the community loses. And those problems keep getting worse and worse because they're never in the driver's seat of social policy or political decision making. That's the deal that's cut. And what I'm saying is that we as a nation governed by and for the people have got to begin to hold our leaders accountable to a different standard. That humility becomes the sign of greatness, and not the willingness to stand up and tell us how great you are. That a call for unity and an understanding becomes a fundamental requirement and not a casual assumption that, you know, those folks are always going to be those folks and they're always going to have those beliefs. Whether those folks are women or those folks are blacks or those folks are Republicans or those folks are Democrats. This is a time when the nation is under attack as it is now. It's a time for all people of goodwill and social conscience and moral conscience to band together for the good of the group. You know, there's a lot of unity when the enemy's coming over the hill and shooting at you. A whole lot of unity. And nobody wants to take a vote, nobody wants to consult about anything because the issue is real clear. I'm ringing that bell now, and I'm telling you that we could spend 3 days detailing the decline of our nation and what's wrong with it. We don't want to do that. But it is that critical, and it requires that degree of attention. So the quality of leadership is going to have to change, and we're going to have to ask ourselves, Where are those leaders who are not trapped in the ghettos of self-interest, but who will lead us full of self-abnegation and full of genuine concern for others to higher ground? Martin Luther King said at one point that to understand how a community or a family or a nation progresses, we must never forget that injustice anywhere, he said, is a threat to justice everywhere. He said that we're all tied together in a single garment of destiny. What happens to one directly happens to everyone indirectly. One cannot disassociate my condition, my life, my well-being from the condition, the life, and the well-being of the community at large, because what happens to the community today or tomorrow happens to me. And unfortunately, we have spent a long time teaching folks that they can go their own way, and that as long as you're okay, everything's going to be fine. Well, I live down in Wilmette, and I'm aware of a guy who had been a corporate VP forever, lives in $1 million house, sent his kids to great schools, had a chance to take a bank presidency toward the end of his career, did. The federales seized the bank about 6 weeks later. He was out of a job and has never recovered. And he sits around the house asking himself, what did I do wrong? I went to the right schools, I served the community, I was in the Rotarians, I was doing all kinds of things. And yet suddenly, at the end of my life, when I ought to be thinking about the accomplishments and feeling good about where the kids are and that the marriage is sound and I've served the community and I lived a good life, I'm out of work and out of luck. That's not the byproduct of a economic consolidation. That is the fruit of greed over decades that leaves folks who have worked on jobs for 30 and 40 years out of work because it makes good economic sense for the company, but contributes nothing to the community. We've got to begin to ask ourselves questions about these things and hold our leadership and our institutions accountable for standards that are mutually beneficial and supportive to the individual and to the community. Now, I've talked a lot about these standards, and I want to briefly go over what I think they are. And I want to mention to you that no matter what the specific issue is, I believe that these principles, which are fundamentally spiritual in content, are absolutely at the core of what's wrong with this nation and, frankly, what's wrong with this world. And that if we are going to have unity at any level, we're going to have to address these fundamental questions. The first is the purpose principle, and that is the whole issue of what we do with our time in life. What is our purpose? And I want to suggest to you that every major initiative that has ever been made and benefited people on a large scale has had a high and noble purpose. And that even the most menial tasks, when offered in the spirit of service to another person, when offered in the spirit of assistance and upliftment to another human being, is noble in character. And that the importance of emphasizing noble purpose is that it mobilizes the most noble forces in the souls of human beings. And if you want to rally people around an important cause, you've got to explain to them why it's noble and give them an opportunity to manifest their true selves. Because I believe at the core of human creation is a noble soul that has been somewhat hindered by dysfunctional social training, which has caused us to think that money and position and status are the right things. There's a story about a visitor to Rome at the peak of the Roman civilization who sees the grandeur of Rome and the magnificence of the civilization, the wealth, the architecture, the mathematical achievements, the art, the philosophy, the beauty of Rome at its peak, and wonders where the walls are to protect this magnificent city. Because this visitor comes from a decaying civilization. And one of the hallmarks of a decaying civilization is that it builds barriers around itself, never realizing that the enemy is inside the city and not outside the city. And so the visitor to Rome can't wait to meet and ask a Roman where the walls are to protect this great city. And when he finally encounters a Roman and puts this question to him, the Roman responds that the walls that protect Rome are in the hearts of the Romans. And those are the walls of learning, of moral and spiritual development, of service to one another, of a strong sense of ethics and fairness, and of individual discipline, all of which are required in order to maintain the cohesion of a society and to muster the power necessary to cause that society to advance. One of the key elements is this summons to nobility. Second, I believe, is the Pygmalion principle. Now this, I like to think of this as the Flip Wilson principle of the development of spirit and character, because it was Flip Wilson who told us that what you see is what you get. So as we look at each other, what we see is what we get. And if what we see is the possibility for endless conflict and folks that are less good than us and folks that just don't deserve what we deserve, then that's what we get. But if we look further and we begin to see that everybody's got kids that they love and everybody wants to do well, and we're going to have to do a whole lot of heavy lifting in order to create that level playing field that everybody's always talking about. But we're going to have to look at people and circumstances and opportunities differently than we have been looking at them before and raise questions fundamentally of principle. Is it in the best interest of the community? And not does it benefit this group or that group? Let's begin to hold ourselves accountable to that level of examination. The third is the service principle. And this is one that I am happy to say is catching on nationwide. We are succeeding in redeveloping a sense of the importance of service. But let me just give you an idea of how important service is from a psychological development standpoint. Service is such a powerful antidote to the things that ail us that psychiatric research has told us for quite some time that among the most powerful things you can do, in fact, the most effective but least used cure for mild depression, for anger, for the blues, is service to somebody else. It's better than alcohol, it's better than drugs, it's better than go do something for someone else and you will be the primary beneficiary. We know this whenever we're involved in any kind of service activity because we feel fantastic. We feel rich, we feel powerful, we feel useful, we feel like we're doing the right thing. Where people are engaged in service, there those spirits are blossom in their hearts, and it is a constant point of upliftment. Well, given our current circumstances, there are abundant opportunities for us to serve one another in a way that will help everybody prosper. And here I want to make some suggestions to my black and white friends here. In considering the whole issue of racial unity, everybody is going to have to make some adjustments. On one hand, white people will have to deal with the whole subconscious issue of superiority because the world was made for you. I mean, this is a country that you have built and controlled and assume is yours to an extent that black people have not been a part of that. Black people, on the other hand, are going to have to forgive white people. And I don't mean say I forgive you, I mean let it go. Because anger and resentment is dysfunctional and it's holding us back. So everybody is going to have to let go of a lot of baggage that has held us back from coming together as a community and saying, look, how do we make sure all of our kids go to college? How do we make sure the community is well employed? How do we make sure everyone has a decent place to live? How do we make sure that law is enforced equitably and evenly in all neighborhoods of the community? How do we make sure that churches prosper and so on and so forth? These are issues that can only be solved by a community that is willing to let go of partisan interests and individual bias. The next is the intimacy principle. And that is the whole idea that you cannot have unity in a marriage, in a family, in a community, in a state, or in a nation unless you foster close bonds of friendship and association. How would it be possible? There is no precedent for a thriving society that was in conflict with itself. It's never happened. What we see is a long history of civilizations that prospered, became divided within themselves among their own citizens, and tore themselves up until there was no trace of them. And so instead of having the 5th generation of the Parthenon, we have the ancient ruins of Greece, one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known, and the birthplace of most of the ideas that found Western civilization. And yet there are only ruins where a magnificent civilization used to be. And most of the ruins of Rome we can't even find. Where is Egypt? The Egypt that we read about, the Egypt of the pharaohs. Those civilizations have passed away, and it wasn't because they were conquered from outside. There was no modern day, there was no latter day or early day equivalent of the evil empire that came and vanquished those civilizations. They tore themselves up because of the abandonment of these very same standards. The whole issue of the consultation principle is extremely pivotal. This notion that we have got to sit and work it out and consult about it as a community. I think that this perhaps is the most pivotal because consultation is the only means to achieving justice. You won't know what I need until you ask me and engage me in a discussion with an opportunity to hear my voice and allow me to express my concerns. And then we have to cultivate as a community a consultative approach to problem solving. If we do that, the byproducts are that we will give rise to trust, we will give rise to equity, fairness, and justice. And we will have a process that we can sustain over time in order to make sure that our progress continues and is not hindered by any crisis or by any collapse of trust and understanding. The excellence principle is next on my list. And what I want to say about this is that excellence is not just a question of doing the right thing well. It is a question of understanding that we define ourselves by our habits. So if we want to ask ourselves kind of who are we, think of what you do with your time, and that'll be the truest measure of who you are as a person. Aristotle raised the philosophical question. He said, we are what we repeatedly do. He said that excellence is not an act, but a habit. That we are what we repeatedly do. And so the question becomes, to what degree are we committed to finding the very best solutions in every aspect of our lives and making that a routine pattern that characterizes our way of thinking and our way of interacting with one another and our way of conceptualizing social service. Just two others, a brief story, and then we're going to open it up for questions. The last two are first the integrity principle, and I want to make a point here. To a certain degree, I worry that we have given in to Spartan law. You know, Spartan law in Sparta, the crime wasn't punishable. It was getting caught doing the crime that was punishable. And I wonder whether or not in modern day America, lawyers haven't become the high priests of right and wrong. You know, the truth of the matter is, if you do a big crime, you're guaranteed a book deal, a made-for-TV movie, and more wealth than you could have made in 10 years in a good job. Isn't that true? You will be on Larry King Live, and we will watch you on court TV. Don't do a minor crime, because if you hold up a 7-Eleven with a squirt gun, you'll disappear and never be heard of again. But if you do something huge, you got a book deal coming down the pike right away. And there's something wrong with the way we're thinking about that. I mean, it's just fundamentally wrong. What are we saying to each other? And what are we saying to our kids? We spend more time glorifying bad guys than we do identifying good guys. And the result is, how the heck are the kids going to know who to follow? When rap music became the big deal, and my kids said, well, Dad, you know, rap's not all bad, I reminded them that rap was not an invention of the 80s. My grandfather used to rap. But you know what he was rapping in those days? History. Rap was used as a way to teach little black kids the history of the nation, the history of the church, the history of the family, the history of the Bible, and these clever rhymes were made and they were chained. And so I would be with my grandfather and he'd be painting. And he would be teaching me by rapping the history of the nation and the history of our family and all kinds of things. And I would learn this stuff by learning his rap, because it had a beat and it was funny and it was clever and it was witty, and that's how it was used. God, that it could be used again that way. We are glorifying the wrong things. Last point I want to make is just one more point about integrity. Without a sense of integrity, without confidence that people will increasingly do the right thing for the right reason, there is no foundation for trust, and there is no foundation for confidence. And everybody here who's been married for more than 2 weeks knows the truth of what I'm telling you. The last principle is the paladin principle. Now, this is my personal favorite. You know what paladin means? Paladin means, it's not the guy in the black suit with the gun. It's just an interesting story about that. You remember that TV show, Paladin? What did that guy do, really? I mean, didn't he sit around in hotels in San Francisco? And he had an attendant. And what was his name? His name was Hey Boy. That was the guy's name. And as near as I could figure, Hey Boy's job was to come around and light his cigar and tell him when trouble was happening. Now, it's interesting for me to note that if we look at the demographics of the world, Hey Boy is 568 of every 1,000 people in the world. 568 of every 1,000 people in the world are Asian. What if he got mad? What if he came back and said, you know, I didn't like the way you were talking to me? Anyway, this was a perversion of the paladin concept. What paladin means is heroic champion of virtue. And what we have in many areas of the country and of every community are heroic champions of virtue who are going out and doing all these things because they're the right things. Now, I want you to know that I didn't come by all of this feeling about the importance of these principles by myself. We conducted a number of studies called Models of Unity, Racial, Ethnic, and Religious, to find out who was in the process of building unity. And what we found in Chicago, in Atlanta, in Pasadena, in Portland, Oregon, in New Jersey, and all around the country, we've conducted about 30 of these studies so far, with thousands and thousands of respondents from every stratum of society. What we found was that while there is indeed a 300% increase in hate crime, there is also a parallel process underway in the very same America, and that is, there is an increasing number of people who are working together to tackle the very problems that we're